This is a Roqe Media series, The Contemporary History of Iran, Part 14. Hi there, and welcome to the Contemporary History of Iran, a series from Roqe Media. This is Part 14, America and Iran before 1979. I'm Jian Ghomeshi. Our aim with this series is to explore the events, personalities, and issues that have shaped modern Iran. We want to do this as much as possible through a non-traditional lens, through snapshots of change, and using alternative voices or angles. This series is mostly in English, and will feature a new episode posted every Thursday across our Roqe Media platforms. We will post subtitled excerpts with Farsi Zirnavis on our YouTube and Instagram sites. We are coming to you on roqemedia.com. It is there that you can link to all of our platforms, and we invite you to check out parts 1 through 13 of this series that are already posted. To become a sponsor or patron of Roqe Media, please contact us through our website. The Contemporary History of Iran is brought to you in part by Yazdani Law Group. YLG is one of the largest Iranian-Canadian immigration law firms. Their mission, rooted in the leadership of founder Afshin Yazdani, is built on continuously striving to innovate and introduce new immigration pathways for their clients. Afshin began his career as a lawyer and law professor in Iran, and his company has now made it their goal to provide the best, simplest, least risky, and most inexpensive way to immigrate to Canada. YLG has an impressive track record, hundreds of applications from Iran successfully processed every year. They are at YLGPC on Instagram. All right, let's get started. Here now is the Contemporary History of Iran, Part 14. Well, in looking at the contemporary history of Iran, there can be no international relationship more significant, more beloved, more bilateral, more controversial, and ultimately more adversarial than that between Iran and the United States. Today, we know America and Iran to be publicly declared enemies that engage in verbal sabre-rattling, threats and sanctions, and a tenuous on and off again nuclear deal. But if the relationship between the U.S. and Iran is troubled today, and we date that back to 1979 and the revolution that removed an American-friendly Shah and followed with a hostage crisis, and even if we go back to the problems arising for many Iranians in 1953 and the U.S. role in a coup to remove the prime minister, what about the years in between and before these moments in history? In other words, if we look at the totality of the relationship between America and Iran before 1979, what might we find? In fact, the answer seems to be the story of two nations who engaged in decades of mutual respect, admiration, and overt cooperation. In fact, we see a long-standing courtship that at times veered into romance. To discuss America and Iran before 1979, I'm joined by an acclaimed historian who has quite literally recently written a very detailed book about this subject. Dr. Jian Ghazvinian is an author, historian, and former journalist. He was born in Iran and raised in London and Los Angeles. Dr. Ghazvinian obtained his PhD in history at Oxford University. He's currently the executive director of the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Dr. Ghazvinian has written for numerous publications such as Newsweek, The Nation, and The Sunday Times, and was the recipient of a Public Scholar Fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities in 2016-2017, as well as a fellowship from the Carnegie Corporation's Special Initiative on Islam in 2009-2010. He is the author of Untapped, The Scramble for Africa's Oil, as well as the co-editor of American and Muslim Worlds Before 1900. And as I mentioned, his latest book published this past year is entitled America and Iran, A History from 1720 to the Present. And right now, Dr. Jian Ghomeshi joins me from Philadelphia today. Hello, sir.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
Such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for doing this. And your book, I must say, is quite spectacular.
Thank you. That's very kind of you to say.
John, you seem to take the position that you believe we need to rethink or reapproach the way we see relations between America and Iran, and that rather than focus on simply the adversarial nature of the current period, to actually see this as something of an aberration inside a history that has, for the most part, over 3 centuries, been a very friendly and mutually appreciative relationship. Would that be your case?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And I think what even surprised me when I started doing the research for this book, I think there's a tendency for those of us who are interested in the history of U.S.-Iran relations, sort of anecdotally or as sort of amateurs, to kind of assume that it is a relationship marked by hostility and negativity and antagonism, and to kind of look for where those antagonisms began. When I think the reality, and to many ways feel sort of trapped by that history. And I think there's a tendency to say, oh, well, talk about the 1979 hostage crisis or the 1953 coup, as you suggested in your introduction. And that somehow we're still trapped by those kinds of original sins and so on. In reality, I think history can liberate us if we actually look at the broader, deeper history of U.S.-Iran relations. Because over a couple of centuries, it's marked by a remarkable degree of mutual warmth, mutual admiration, fascination, and even a kind of mutual idealization.
And why would it be good to know that? I mean, why is it so important to you to make the case that the relationship has not been as acrimonious over the years? How does that serve us?
Well, because I think that when you sort of ask yourself, well, when you begin with antagonism, you will end with antagonism. If you're kind of looking for where the problems are and how the problems began, you're also inherently looking for whose fault it is and who started it and things like that. Those are the questions you're asking. And I think as historians, those are not the questions we should be asking. People are certainly, I think, as people, we're entitled to kind of wonder that. But I think we also have to ask ourselves, well, if the relationship is so bad, has it always been? How did it get to be so bad? And if so, how did it get to be good in the first place, perhaps? Was there a time when things weren't so bad? And what does that reveal? Because I think that when we look at it that way, we appreciate it not only do we appreciate the history in a different way, but we also appreciate what has been lost and what can be regained. It is true that Americans began to look at Iran in a very different way after 1979, and that Iranians on the whole began to look at the United States in a very different way after 1953. But the question is, well, what was lost? What is the world that was lost when these problems began? And I think that's also just as interesting.
I'm assuming this is not to say that they're not to dismiss or downplay any legitimate beefs that, say, Iranians might have with American imperialism in the 20th century, or a CIA-led coup, or current-day sanctions, or whatever, right?
Right, or the legitimate concerns that the United States might have with the activities of the Islamic Republic.
Absolutely, absolutely.
These are all very legitimate things, but I think they do not characterize the overwhelming history of these two countries. It's a very different kind of history when you look at the whole story.
What seems to be really novel about your book, I mean, is that you've looked at this relationship. And you've decided to go way back before, say, mid-20th century, something that most historians haven't done. In fact, I've seen historians comment on this book and go, I had no idea what this guy's writing about in the 18th century is a revelation to me. Why did you want to go back so far?
I didn't initially. It was the book sort of led in that direction. I mean, initially I said, look, I want to get past 1979 and 1953. I want to get past the blame game of who started it and so on. But then the obvious next question was, well, where do you begin? And a lot of American historians, I realized, begin around 1940, because that's when you start to get major American advisory missions, military advisory missions, financial advisory missions coming to Iran. But I think the problem with that is that that's because and they don't look at anything before 1940, because before that the U.S. is an isolationist power, and the State Department archives suggest that Iran simply wasn't very important to the United States before that, which was fine. But the problem with that is that you're only approaching the history from the U.S. perspective. I mean, the history of U.S.-Iran relations doesn't just begin when the United States becomes interested in Iran.
Right.
It turns out that well before that, the successive Iranian governments were very interested in cultivating better relations with the United States. So you could start the history in the 1850s or 1860s with the first kind of political relations between the two countries. But then I thought, well, why are we only talking about politics? What about relations between the people?
Right.
And those begin much earlier. They begin in the 1830s, when you have Presbyterian missionaries from the US going over to Iran to build schools and clinics and try to convert people to American-style Presbyterian Christianity. That's where I could have begun, but then I thought I did something a little bit more eccentric, which is to say, well, what about the prehistory, the preconceived notions? When in any relationship between two people, there is the story of their relationship, but there's a story of what they might have thought before they even met. And I thought that's just as interesting. And I was very surprised to find, I didn't expect to find much, but I was surprised to find that in both countries there are a lot of preconceived notions before there's any kind of contact.
Right.
For example, as early as the 1720s, a full century before any Americans and Iranians really started to interact with one another, you had colonial American newspapers, writing with great detail and great enthusiasm about Iran, and that surprised me. And why do I think that's relevant? Because I think a lot of the assumptions and ideas that they began to develop actually were informed a lot of the first impressions Americans had of Iranians, and actually, I think in some ways, had an afterlife that actually lasted well into the 1970s.
It's amazing that when you talk about these early American newspapers in the early 1700s, it's astounding, because it's so counterintuitive to think that there's these American papers, 300 years ago, writing about how great Persia is, and yet there's something at work here which is also fascinating, which is that you underscore, which is that if today the issue is that for Americans and Iranians, I mean, we're generalizing here, but for the most part, there are these tit for tat notions that are steeped in negative generalizations and stereotypes. That we've always had trouble with that calibration when it comes to Iran and America, because you say the histories of Iran and America back then, and for the most part until the mid 20th century, are based on mutual idealization. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is, and I could say a lot about this, but just very, very briefly, I mean, if you look at some of the newspapers of the 1720s, they are not only obsessed with Iran, because there happens to be a big news story going on in Iran at the time, the collapse of the Safavid Empire, but they're very, very pro-Iranian. They have an idealized view of Iran, and I explain in the book why that is. It's for a number of different reasons, both religious and political. They see the Persian Empire as the enemy of my enemy, is my friend, because the Persians were the great arch rivals of the Ottoman Empire, which was seen as the great evil empire of its day. They are seen as less Muslim because they're Shia, and they're also, there's the knowledge that people have from the Bible, where the Persians are, they look good in the Bible. Cyrus frees the Jews from Babylonian captivity, and the three magi, the three wise men from the east, the Zoroastrian priests, and so on, were probably Persians. So they have an idealized view of Iran to begin with. It's almost, I don't want to say that view doesn't change over the next couple of centuries, but there is something about that is surprisingly constant throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. This idea that Persia, that Iran is this kind of exotic oriental kingdom that's slightly further to the east of everything that is seen as threatening or sinful about the Muslim world. And it plays into, in many ways, the way that Iran, or at least the Iranian government, presented itself as late as the 1970s, right? And there's a whole generation of Iranians and Iranians in exile as well today, in diaspora, as we know, who continue to perpetuate this sort of Aryan myth and this sort of
Right,
idea that,
right, right.
that, well, we're not really Muslim, we're not really Middle Eastern, we're sort of, so,
Well, I want to get to that, but this Persophilia, as you call it, uh,
mm,
it infects. It goes as high as the founding fathers. I mean, you talk about
mm.
how everyone from Jefferson to Franklin to Adams knew of and spoke grandly of ancient Persian history. What did you make of that when you discovered it?
Yeah, there's a great respect for Persian history and ancient Persian history. They didn't know much about contemporary Iran, but what they did know of Persia was, as I say, partly from the Bible, but also from a lot of the classical studies that a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers and the founding fathers had. I mean, they were deeply familiar with the Greek writings on the Persians from the ancient period, um, which, if you've read Herodotus and if you've read other ancient Greek writers, you know that although they were great arch enemies of the Persians and fought wars for decades, had a sort of begrudging respect for the Persians. I mean, Herodotus was, famously a huge admirer of the Persians. I mean, you had even that famous post office motto, that is chiseled into the New York post office in 1911: neither snow nor sleet nor
Sleet.
rain nor gloom of night shall stay these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds, is drawn from Herodotus. He's praising the Persian Empire
Ah.
for its very efficient postal service. That it was the first major, large continental postal service that an empire had created. But in addition to Herodotus, you had other ancient Greek writers like Xenophon, who wrote this book called Sabre-ratting, which was a sort of hagiography, a sort of praising account of Cyrus, the Emperor Cyrus. That, surprisingly to me, was read widely by people like John Adams and Jefferson. We know that Jefferson owned two copies, and he had notes in the margin where he compared the
Hmm.
difference between them. And that Abigail Adams told her son, John Quincy Adams, to read this and learn about how to be a leader from Cyrus's example. I mean, we know that the founding fathers were very sort of neoclassical and very interested in ancient Greek and Roman history. But I think what we don't know is that they also had a great appreciation for ancient Persian history, actually.
And you talk about by 1800, there's a keen understanding and knowledge of Persian history, even amongst American school children, who, for the most part, knew the story of Cyrus the Great. Cyrus was it was a household name, you say, in America. And this is tit for tat because in the 19th century, and you mentioned it a little earlier in this interview, the Iranian government, you say, or the Iranian regimes, wanted an alliance with the Americans, hoping for some kind of third force to counter the role of Russians and the British. The Iranians wanted more U.S. involvement, which would be kind of ironic if people see this through the lens of 21st century relations. The idea was that the Iranians felt the U.S. was not coming with an imperialist mentality. Can you speak to that?
Exactly. Just as early Americans kind of idealized the Persian Empire, the Persians of the 19th century and well into the 20th century really idealized the United States and saw it as a sort of a different kind of European power, because they saw America. They believed they saw Americans as Europeans, basically just Europeans who were very far away, and they saw them as preferable to the British Empire or the French or the Russians, who in many cases were taking advantage of Iran's weakness to manipulate and interfere in Iranian affairs behind the scenes. But what they saw in the United States was a country that had all the economic and political and military progress of the West that they could learn from, but without the greed and the cynicism. They saw the U.S. in the 1860s and 1870s as a country that had come to power 100 years earlier in a revolution against the British Empire, as a country that didn't seem to want to interfere in the affairs of smaller and weaker countries. And this was perpetuated. In the 1910s, during the Woodrow Wilson presidency, they really admired the U.S. for its kind of policy of non-interference and so on. One of to me, the most delicious ironies of early U.S.-Iran kind of political relations in the 1850s and 60s, right? Is it the very first treaty that the two countries negotiated with each other was in the 1850s.
Right.
And it was the first disagreement that the two countries had. They spent 5 years arguing about this treaty in the 1850s. It took them longer to negotiate that than it took the US and Iran to negotiate the nuclear deal in the 2010s.
All right.
And you think, what are they arguing about in the 1850s? And it turns out one of the big sticking points was that the Iranian government wanted to buy American warships and fly the Stars and Stripes and have them manned by American sailors
Right.
as part of the Persian
It's
Navy to send a
amazing.
message,
It's
right? To
amazing.
send a message to the British Empire in the Persian Gulf to say, look, we have this new ally. And the U.S.'s response was, oh, we don't want any part of it. We don't want to interfere in your business, which is the direct opposite of the arguments they have today, right?
Why was Nasser al-Din Shah, you talk about this in the book, the monarch of Iran in the second half of the 19th century, I mean, for 50 years, why was he in particular so taken by the United States?
Well, there's not much evidence that he particularly was, although there is some evidence of this. It's his governments, his prime ministers, in particular Amir Kabir in the 1850s. There is some evidence that Nasruddin Shah, I mean, when he traveled, he never went to the U.S., of course. The last Shah of Iran was the only Shah who ever traveled to the U.S. In Iranian history. But Nasruddin Shah did travel to Europe a few times, and in one of his trips, he remarked in his diary about the wealthy Americans that he saw on Regent Street in London. And he remarked on the bales of American cotton that were being unloaded on Liverpool docks. You know, he clearly had some awareness of this as a rising economic and political power of the United States. But it was more of a generation of political officials and thinkers and intellectuals and newspaper editors in the 1850s and 60s who were really smitten by the U.S. example. And again, they saw the U.S., as I say, as a country that seemed to mind its own business. They kind of loved that. I mean, the U.S. I mean, there were a lot of American missionaries, you know, building schools and clinics and working in
Yes,
Iran at the time, but
yes.
there was no American embassy and there was no legation, and that was striking to Iranians because there were plenty of British Anglican missionaries and Russian Orthodox missionaries, not even as many as there were Americans actually in many cases, but yeah, and yet the Russian and British legations, the embassies had a very strong political presence in Iran, and that was interesting. It was an interesting observation to Iranians that, you know, we have Americans who just seem to be here to kind of help and build schools and clinics, and yeah, proselytize as well, but their government seems not to be interested. And that alone made the U.S. kind of appealing. You know, this country that just didn't want to get sucked in.
Fair to say
Iran,
the U.S. was not tainted the way Britain and the French and Russia were.
yeah, it was easy to idealize the U.S., and I think frankly, that's a lot of what was happening. It's not that the U.S. had this extremely kind of particularly noble approach to Iran. It's just they just didn't care, and they're
Again,
just not
yeah,
interested.
the mutual idealization, as you say earlier. Yeah.
Right.
So when we get into the 20th century, John, you mentioned President Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, a few minutes ago. Tell me about the U.S. under Woodrow Wilson coming to the support of Iranian sovereignty in 1919, 1920, right around the proposed Anglo-Persian agreement with the British that had been announced and had drawn the ire of much of the Iranian population. How important was Wilson's stand to Iranians?
Yeah, this is a fascinating episode, right? Because there's no evidence that Wilson spent a lot of time thinking about Iran personally, but you know, he articulated this agenda of self-determination for the small and the weak states as well as the large and the powerful, which was pretty revolutionary at the time for an American or for any kind of great world leader, especially one that had just, you know, won the war, won a world war. You know, and he believed that all countries that have been affected by the war should be represented at the peace conference in Paris in 1919. The British felt very differently. They felt that only belligerents should be represented at the table, and that Iran was officially neutral during the war, so it had nothing to talk about. Well, it happened. I mean, Iran may have been neutral during the First World War, but all of the great powers, the British, the French, the Germans, the Russians, you know, and even the United States, had been in some way or another, you know, crisscrossing Iranian territory, involving Iran and the Ottoman Empire as well. Most importantly, involving Iran in the war. That, you know, very very large numbers of Iranians, hundreds of thousands, had died of famine. You know, Iran had suffered greatly because of its own weakness, because of basically the presence of foreign forces on its soil, who just simply disregarded Iran's declaration of neutrality in the war. And so the U.S. and other powers felt that alone gave Iran a right to seek some kind of reparations. The British felt differently. They said, "Look, that's fine, but we'll speak on Iran's behalf at the Paris conference." And the U.S. didn't like this approach. They said that they felt that it smacked of kind of high-handed imperialism. Long story short, the British did a secret deal with the Shah, an Anglo-Persian agreement that they announced in 1919 that basically said, we'll help to compensate Iran for its losses, but actually we also will then take an advisory role in the running of the Iranian government's affairs.
Right.
It's extremely unpopular in Iran, as well as in the United States, and even in Britain, to be honest. And the U.S. actually made public its dissatisfaction for this arrangement. And that alone brought the U.S. so much popularity in Iran. There were pro-American demonstrations in the streets of Tehran in 1919.
When you talk about the big bumps in the road, the very big bumps in the road in this relationship being 1953 and 1979, if we talk about the 53 coup, something that's very curious that often we forget things. When you think about the coup and you think, okay, they removed Mossadegh, he must have been anti-American or something. In 1951, as you talk about, Mossadegh actually visits the UN, visits the United States, and leaves Americans and the American media deeply impressed. But the American administration then becomes obviously less enthusiastic and ends up overseeing a coup to remove Mossadegh and buttress the Shah. Simply put, from your perspective, why?
The Cold War is the short answer. The British had a long-standing disagreement with Mossadegh because he was trying to nationalize, or he had nationalized the Anglo-Iranian oil company, which for a long time had a British company, which for a long time had a monopoly over the production and profits on Iranian oil. Iran and the United Kingdom had broken off political ties, and there was a real standoff between the two countries. The U.S. was trying to play the honest broker under the Truman administration, but when Eisenhower is elected in 1952, he comes to power on a wave of anti-Soviet, anti-communist sentiment in the United States. He's the first Republican to win back the White House in 20 years, and he does so. The campaign is very focused on the Red Scare. And the British realize that this is an angle they can work. So they go to work with the incoming directors of the CIA and the State Department, the Dulles brothers, are sort of fire-breathing anti-communists, and they convince them. They said, look, everyone knows Mossadegh is not a communist. He has no, that's well known. But as the British begin to undermine his government and impose sanctions and weaken the state and so on, Mossadegh finds it harder and harder. They start to buy off his enemies and etc. Mossadegh finds it harder and harder to govern without the support of the street demonstrations, and in many cases those are led by the communists, and he loathes the communists. But it becomes very easy for the CIA and others to put news, magazine articles in front of the Eisenhower administration that says, look, Mossadegh's government is weak, it's in trouble, it's having to rely on communist support, and Iran, frankly, is a weak third world country that is not ready for democracy of the kind that Mossadegh wants, and the Soviets are just waiting in the wings to take advantage. So you've got to do something, and that's the rest is history, as they say.
Given that a coup occurs, and obviously there's some disagreement on this in the contemporary Persian community, but I mean, it's fair to say, at least most historians would argue, there was a coup, there was a popular prime minister who was removed. It's actually quite remarkable that following this, there are almost 30 years of solidarity with the Iran and the United States, and you say many Iranians and even the Iranian media remain somehow sympathetic or kind of forgiving towards the Americans. Why do you think that is?
There's a solidarity at the state-to-state level after 53. There is a very strong solidarity between the government of the Shah, the last Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and successive American presidents and administrations, although to greater and lesser degrees. But there is less and less solidarity on the Iranian street with the United States. And I don't want to say that suddenly everything changes after 53, but it does in the minds especially of the modern, educated middle classes of Iran, who are the bedrock of Mossadegh's support. They simply never see the U.S. the same way again. Opposition to the U.S. more broadly in Iranian society takes longer. It develops gradually over the 1960s and 70s as the Shah drifts towards autocratic government and is seen more and more as a king who is propped up by United States support. Not entirely true, of course, but it's how he's seen. He never really lives down the fact that his throne was secured for him in 1953 by the Americans.
Right.
So it's a gradual process. but you're right. Even in I think what you're referring to is specifically some of the pro-Mossadegh media just before the coup, who are critical of the U.S., but in much, much milder terms than they are of the
Yes.
British, for
They're
example.
kind of saying, well, they don't know any better, they're kind of forgiving them. It plays into what your thesis that this idealization, that this undercurrent never really leaves, even when there's atrocities or problems on either side.
There's a belief, right? There's a belief. I think a lot of our kind of Iranian diaspora listeners of a certain age will know this. There's a belief, of a generation well into the 1960s and 70s, right? Of that generation of Iranians that simply cannot, that tends to see Americans as naive and sort of not very bright, not very kind of experienced in world affairs, and but the British are somehow the ones that are behind everything, right? Kar Ingilisaz is just one of those things that I mean, it's only the more recent generations of Iranians that I think have begun to shed some of that. My parents' generation very much still sees it that way.
The solidarity that you talk about at the state level between the Shah and successive American presidents, there's an exception to that to a certain extent with Kennedy. President Kennedy comes to power in 1960, and you talk about it being a shaky relationship with the Shah. They don't seem to be fans of each other. Why?
No, they really loathe each other. It's interesting. I mean, publicly, officially, the U.S. and Iran are good friends, but they simply don't share a vision. It's interesting. I mean, I think you can look at it on a sort of psychological level. They're men of roughly the same age, but they're very different in their political temperament. The Shah has been in power for a while, and he doesn't respect Kennedy. He thinks Kennedy is a kind of neophyte, that he doesn't really understand world politics, that he's too idealistic, that he hasn't been in power long enough, that the Shah really respects Nixon, thinks he's a man who really understands. He's a realist who understands how the world works. And he really is rooting for Nixon to win the 1960 election, and is very disappointed.
And by the way, Nixon takes a shine to the Shah all the way back to 53 as well, right? That's mutual, right?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, Nixon was Eisenhower's vice president during the 1953 coup and played a role in securing the Shah's power. And he's the first American vice president to visit Iran in 1954, immediately after the coup, at the end of 53. They have a long-standing. They really grow to like each other from very, very early on, and Nixon they both see each other as people who are kind of realistic and kind of understand realpolitik and But the Shah looks at Kennedy as someone who's a dreamer and an idealist, and he hears these speeches about the kind of the new frontier and so on, and he just thinks this guy doesn't get it. He doesn't get that we're dealing with the Soviet Union with an 1,100-mile border on our north. We need strength, we need discipline, we need military hardware, we need a strong military to defend against the Soviet Union. The Shah is a strongly anti-communist leader. And later in the Cold War, the American presidents like Johnson and Nixon really come to value that. But Kennedy has this belief, and it's a holdover from the kind of, in some ways, the Truman Democrats. In some ways, it's this kind of belief that the way you fight communism in the developing world, in the third world, is not by supporting strongmen, building up military, but actually by supporting leaders who are trying to reform and provide kind of social welfare and improved living conditions, because that will take away the appeal of communism in third world countries. It will make people less likely to turn to communism if their bellies are full, if if their schools are good and their hospitals are good and so on. That's a very different approach. The Shah doesn't believe that, and neither do the Republicans, neither do Nixon, and Kissinger and so on. They take much more of a philosophy that the third world is too weak and volatile and unstable, and what it needs is strong military defenses against any kind of Soviet invasion or infiltration, and then you can worry about kind of domestic reform agendas. Right. So that's the core of the disagreement between Kennedy and the Shah.
Well, it's a perfect segue, because I was going to say the Nixon Doctrine then into the late 60s, early 70s, finds a special footing in Iran and leads to massive amounts of arms provided to Iran and funds in exchange for Iran becoming a kind of local sheriff of the Middle East. By the mid-1970s, you chronicle that Iran becomes the world's largest purchaser of American military equipment, accounting for more than 1/3 of all U.S. arms sales. So as indispensable as America has been and becomes for the Shah, it would seem that Iran, with that level of purchase power, is becoming indispensable to America as well. Yes?
Exactly. It's very much a two-way street. Look, the Shah is delighted when Nixon comes to power in 1969. Finally, his old friend, after 15 years, finally, reaches the White House, and here's a guy who gets it, who's going to sell us weapons, who understands what we're dealing with. And Nixon, the feeling is mutual. Nixon feels like, the Shah is someone who really understands the challenges that the U.S. is dealing with in the Middle East. Remember that in the late 60s, early 70s, the U.S. is really struggling in Southeast Asia. The Middle East is important, is a region of growing importance, but what they're really looking for is a surrogate, someone who can kind of be a sheriff for the U.S. in the region. And that's the core of the Nixon Doctrine. Now, that doesn't mean that the Shah isn't also very smart and sophisticated in the way that he manipulates the United States in many cases. It's not a purely clientelist relationship, but for Nixon, he's delighted to have someone like the Shah that he can just sell a lot of American weapons to, and just know that Iran will help to reinforce American policy in the Middle East, because it makes it easier for the U.S. to focus on its challenges in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos and elsewhere. It's a sort of marriage of convenience, but also of real mutual respect between the two men.
The Shah's name even comes up at Watergate, the hearings, where the Shah is named as helping to fund the campaign of Nixon in 72.
Yes, there's some speculation about this. It's never well investigated, but there's a newspaper columnist who writes, Jack Anderson, who writes a very insinuating sort of column about whether the Shah's government funneled money to the Nixon's presidential campaign, and the charges are never fully investigated. They're sort of dropped, but they've never been proved either. It's largely speculative. But one thing that is very clear is that the Shah was very much pulling for Nixon to win the election.
I want to get to Carter in a second, but before that, even in this period, as you well know, you write about it in the 60s and in early 70s, and we just did an episode a few weeks ago on Siakal and the growing sort of guerrilla movement against the Shah. There's the communists, there's the liberal nationalists, there's the religious folks. He's getting there's a lot of opposition growing and animosity towards the Shah in various parts of Iran. Americans and the American media even remain generally oblivious to this. Forget about late 70s. We'll get to that in a second. But all through this period, why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's tough. There's a sort of mutually enforcing sort of information industry. At every level. I think the short answer is the Cold War. It's a Cold War mentality that simply doesn't understand the idea of growing religious fundamentalism, or the idea of a kind of conservative religious backlash to dictatorship. The only kind of political instability that anyone's able to see in the 1970s is communists. There's a belief that that the Shah has done a good job of crushing, kind of communist opposition. Communist Party is banned in Iran, and he's in a very strong position, so he's got nothing to worry about. We simply don't see that there's a different kind of opposition that's growing to the Shah, which is a more moral one, a more cultural one, as well as an economic and political one, that everyone's fed up with the Shah's regime for different reasons. And this is one of the extraordinary things about the Iranian Revolution, of course, which is that it meant different things to different people. But one thing everyone united around was that the Shah had to go. But I think that in the U.S., this was, and it wasn't just in the U.S., nowhere in the world did anyone see the revolution coming. This was a guy who had been in power for 25 years, who was in 35 years, who was in complete control of his country, who had one of the world's largest armies, militaries, one of the world's most sophisticated and brutal secret police apparatus, as well as the support of one of the world's two great superpowers, as well as not exactly animosity, but some sort of friendly relations with the other great superpower. What could possibly go wrong?
But by the late 70s, there are, now it's a little more empirical. There's people in the streets, and there's that famous moment that most of the people listening, of a certain vintage, if not interested in this kind of thing, will of course know this famous moment and the quote. But December 31st, 1977, New Year's Eve, the famous visit to the Imperial Palace by Jimmy Carter, President Carter, where he toasts the Shah, and the quote is for the respect, and I want to pay tribute for the respect and admiration and love which your people give to you. And this is only 1 week before the revolution begins. How is it that the U.S., even if you see this from a pro-Shah standpoint, and I know a lot of people listening are, remain pro-Shah, how is it that the U.S. so atrociously miscalculated and underestimated the level of threat that the Shah was facing?
Yes, this is that famous island of stability toast, right? Where Jimmy Carter toasts the Shah. He says that Iran, thanks to your leadership, is an island of stability in an otherwise troubled region.
Right.
That's a phrase that had been used a lot in the 1970s by a kind of American officialdom to describe Iran, and that's how Iran was seen in Washington. The funny thing is, by the way, I think that Carter himself, if not, but certainly the State Department and many levels of the American administration didn't really see the Shah quite that way. Even, as Carter was speaking those words, I think there was some awareness that there were problems. But this is one of the funny things about the Shah, right, is that he was a deeply, deeply insecure man. And one of the things that he needed most was constant sense of reassurance of American friendship. And Jimmy Carter's administration, like John Kennedy's administration before it, they didn't love the Shah. They knew the Shah needed to sort of reform and liberalize, but they were kind of trapped because as much as they wanted to push the Shah in that direction, they also knew that if they pushed him too much, he would get nervous and there would be a backlash. And they also had to sort of reassure him of American friendship all the time. That when he was in his weakest moments, he needed to see these displays of American solidarity. So I think that's what that moment was really all about. I think Carter probably himself even knew as he was saying those words that they weren't quite true, but that would somehow help the Shah. That if you could assuage some of his anxieties and insecurities, that he might actually be able to work. You could work better with him to bring about liberalization and reform. But of course, it's famous last words. As you say, and as I write in the book, it's literally a week later the revolution begins.
Yeah. There's a school of thought that says, I think that we've had a couple of people on the show who've said this, in fact, that from the perspective of the Americans, that Iran doesn't become the enemy because of the revolution, but because of the hostage crisis.
Right.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, this is the thing that's easy to forget, is that the Iranian revolution, at least initially, wasn't, and I want to be careful about how I say this. It's not that it wasn't anti-American or that Khomeini wasn't anti-American. He was anti a lot of things. But America was just one of many things that were on the menu of things that Khomeini didn't like and that a lot of the revolutionaries didn't like. They also hated the Soviets. And the leftists that backed the revolution didn't share that point of view necessarily. But, Khomeini and those closest to him, hated communism as well. They hated all kinds of things. But the revolution initially didn't take an overwhelmingly anti-American direction. It was an anti-Shah revolution. But when the United States gave asylum to the Shah 8 months into the revolution, things changed. There was a concern on the street that, what was happening? Was 1953 about to repeat itself? It was lost on nobody that 26 years earlier, this great moment of national self-determination and kind of nationalism and patriotic kind of fervor around that Mossadegh had been able to bring about in the country was swiftly overturned by a coup led by the CIA, plotted at the American embassy that flew the Shah back into the country. So when people on the streets learned that the Shah was suddenly being admitted to New York for cancer treatment, because he had been in Mexico at the time, they thought, oh boy, no, fool us once, shame on you, fool us twice, shame on us. And so the U.S. Embassy became almost a visible symbol of plotting and intrigue, and what are they really plotting, what are they doing, are they going to try to fly the Shah back into the country again, all this kind of stuff. Ironically, there was no such plot. The Americans had learned from their previous experience. They were not about to try to whisk the Shah back to power. But this was one of the many legacies of 1953, which is that nobody in Iran really believed that. And so there was anxiety about what the embassy was really up to. And that's when you saw the students storming the embassy and overrunning the police barricades. And That's the beginning of the hostage crisis at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran.
And yet, even in the last 40 years, we know that the American and Iranian regimes have not always been that distant. I mean, the Reagan administration, of course, infamously sold arms to Iran through back channels just a few years after this hostage crisis. So, I mean, without playing into our Iranian tendency towards conspiracy theories, do you believe the U.S.-Iran relationship is actually stronger still in the back channels than we're led to believe?
No, I don't think so, actually. I think that it may have been in the 1980s. But this is one of the funny ironies about the last 40 years, which is that when the Iranian Revolution was at its most radical, its most anti-American, when the people on the streets were most anti-American, when the support for the Iranian Revolution was at its height in the 1980s, the U.S. was less hostile to the Islamic Republic than it has been at almost any point since. I mean, again, yeah, I am always fascinated by the fact that here you had Ronald Reagan, the great, conservative, icon, right, who came to power saying, Iran, the Iranian government, they're barbarians, we'll never negotiate with terrorists and so on, was selling weapons through the Israelis to Iran, hoping that it would, help to bring about some sort of back channel improvement in U.S.-Iran relations, as well as get hostages freed in Lebanon and so on. But that Ronald Reagan, when that plot was exposed in the media, came on television in November 1986 and said to the American people, he tried to explain why they'd been doing this. He said, "Look, the Iranian Revolution is a fact of history, but between American and Iranian basic national interests, there need be no permanent conflict. No American president, with the possible exception of arguably of Obama, has spoken like that about Iran since." Even though Iran has actually become gradually less radical and less anti-American in its government, but certainly among its people since the 1990s.
Let me ask you about the people, both in Iran and outside of Iran, and the diaspora and the Americans. I mean, despite this famous animosity that we've been discussing since 1979, and the Death to America rallies in the streets, which existed and exist at times, there has always been a fondness for all things American. I used to try to explain this to friends in high school in the 1980s who would be seeing Iran as an evil place, that, no, actually Iranians love Western cars and denims and hamburgers, and some of that ongoing affection seems to seep into the personal politics of today. There, as you would know, there's no shortage of Iranians in the diaspora who want the United States to intervene or to stage a coup in Iran. Would you say that all in all, after all this recent history and a literal revolution, on some level, we still can't quit America?
Yes, I think there's something to be said for that. I think that even some of that pro-American sentiment that you were talking about or telling your friends about in the 1980s, if anything, it's become much stronger since. I mean, we know this. One thing Iran has in common with the United States is they're both deeply, deeply divided countries, politically and culturally and religiously and morally. This is the thing that always strikes me when I go to Iran from the U.S. is how incredibly similar in some ways the country's politics actually is. It's there. The divisive politics has become a feature of most of the world in recent years, but I think that Iran and the U.S. are both countries that were out in the vanguard of this. And what I mean by that is that when you go to Iran, it really strikes me is that the similarity, like in the United States, I think one of the problems we've had in the U.S. throughout, it's not just recent years, it's actually been going on for a few decades now, is this gradual tendency, our politics has gradually been moving in the direction of, I don't just disagree with you, I reject who you are as a person. It's not that, we have become two very different types of countries. We see this all the time, right? In our lifestyles, in our beliefs, in our kind of the way we look at the people who disagree with us and so on. Iran is very similar in that way. I mean, you have two very different types of Irans. You have many, many different, you have a range of political beliefs, but, to kind of grotesquely oversimplify, I mean, you do have a hard core of people in Iran who are deep believers in the Islamic Republic and who see their identity as Iranians as being very much about religion and the Islamic Republic, and a rejection of the U.S. and the West and American hegemony in the Middle East and so on. And you have a totally different type of Iranian that rebels against anything Islamic, that it's forced on them, that embraces Western culture, and they can't stand each other. I mean, you see it in every little interaction in Iran. It's always kind of under the surface, right? Even when it comes to things like the Shab Yalda, which is striking, because Shab Yalda, I think if you talk to an older generation of Iranians, I mean, sure, people celebrated it in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. Of course they did. But non-religious secular festivals like that have become so much more important to a certain type of Iranian, either in the diaspora or in Iran, that likes to very performatively demonstrate their secularness. And that goes for things like Nowruz, or these kinds of like traditionally Persian, Zoroastrian types of holidays.
Yeah.
Whereas a very different kind of Iranian, doesn't care as much about Shab Yalda, but cares much more about things like Eid al-Qurban and, Eid al-Fitr and things like that, Islamic holidays. There are 2 Mother's Days in Iran, right? There's the kind of Western or American one, and then there's the Feast of Fatima, right? Which was perpetuated by the government. I mean, I think in a lot of little ways like that, it's
it's interesting that you should say that, because I had hoped to get to ask you about it's not just. You were talking about in Iran. You mentioned the diaspora. I mean, the diaspora is balkanized as well, as you know, and highly. It's almost like clockwork. Depending on who we bring on the show or what we're talking about, you get some reaction or another. And I'm thinking about you, and I'm thinking about this book that you spent literally years writing, and the depth of the research and the depth of the comprehensive nature of it. And by all means, I mean, it is very well reviewed and has done very, very well. But, just researching you online, I mean, there's no shortage of accusations, from members of our community, right? That you're some kind of agent of the regime, that you have, written this with an agenda, that you get paid off. And again, that's not that surprising, because anybody who says anything. But tell me about writing a book like this and having to deal with that.
Yeah, I tried to put all that out of my mind when I was writing it, because you will go out of your mind if you try to write a book with trying to please everybody. There's no way you can tackle a topic like this and know that you're going to please everyone. I knew going into this that there were people who would not like the book, no matter what, and you just can't worry about that. I mean, all I was trying to do with this book was simply make sure that every actor in this drama over the past couple of centuries was heard on its own terms, and that when actors make choices, we see why they're doing them, why they're making those choices. That's it. That alone is enough to infuriate some people, because if you have very strident views in one way or one direction or another, doesn't matter what direction they are. We know this of people who have very strong, strident political views, is that they want to see people who don't agree with them as evil, as monsters, as irrational, as people who make choices based on their just inherent evil. And I happen to believe, and people think I'm naive, but I happen to believe that most people don't actually operate that way, that there are very few true sociopaths in this world. If there's a regime that we don't like, and certainly I have no love for the Islamic Republic, but if there's a regime that we don't like, that, I forget how I even began the sentence now, but I happen to believe that, they are making choices based on things that make sense to them, and it's not because they're evil or crazy or sociopathic or psycho. And I think that if you approach things in that way, it's how I approach life, how I approach people who disagree with me as much as I can. I try to walk in their shoes a little bit. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them. Doesn't mean you have to suddenly say that what they've done is not wrong, or that that you're wrong. You lose nothing. In fact, if anything, you're stronger when you can see the humanity in your enemies. I really believe that. And I think that the United States, especially as the world's most powerful country, should be strong enough to be able to see the humanity in its enemies. That doesn't mean you agree with them, or that you don't continue to find ways to perpetuate your own interests.
So
that's fine.
Notwithstanding internet trolls, what has most surprised you, or what has been most interesting in the reaction that you've received to putting this book out there over the past year?
Not that much has surprised me. I think I got the kinds of criticism that I expected to get from sort of mainstream foreign policy establishment, and I welcome it. I wear it as a badge of pride because not because I have, and I'm not, I don't, I'm not a sort of, not because I want to be some sort of rabble rouser or anything. And I don't think actually, if you read the book, it's particularly radical actually. But I think that I know that there has been for a long time a certain kind of consensus in Washington policy making circles about Iran, which I think personally has not been helpful to Washington policy making. It's not, I don't care about the Islamic Republic or Iran or who wins or who loses, but I think that if you're a Washington policymaker and you're trying to win or get an edge or a leg up against Iran, you're doing yourself no favors by living in a fantasy world in which you think the Islamic Republic is about to collapse any minute, and that you can bring about that collapse. That people don't like it when I say that, but it's not. I don't say that because I don't want to see the Islamic Republic collapse. I actually don't care one way or the other about that. As a historian, it's not my job to be cheerleading for one particular outcome or another. As a historian, it's my job to help us understand how we got to where we are. And if your job as a Washington policymaker is to try to defeat Iran in some way, I think you bloody well better understand how we got to where we are. And that means understanding that the Islamic Republic, sadly, whether you like it or not, is not a house of cards that's about to collapse any minute.
It's a great pleasure talking to you. I really do believe the book is spectacular. And part of the reason, it's quite telling that in discussing the history of the United States and Iran, you're really discussing Iranian history. I mean, it's 600 pages or whatever it is of really learning, of going through Iranian history over the last 200 or 300 years. What is your, if I could ask a final question, and I'm sure it's a cliche one, you're used to at this point, but perhaps that means you have an answer. What is your gut sense of what the next chapter of Iran and America will be?
Sadly, I think it's more of the same. A lot of containment. I think we're back to the 90s in a lot of ways, where there's a sort of a distance and a containment and a lack of real movement one way or the other. A sort of low-grade Cold War, if you will. I wish that wasn't the case, but I sort of feel that both countries are kind of given up on a better relationship. The sort of reformists and elements in Iran have been very badly undermined by the withdrawal of the U.S. from the JCPOA, and I think there's a interest in cultivating better relations with China instead. And I think in the U.S. there's also a real exhaustion with the Middle East and a desire to move on to other things like China and Russia. And I just I think the two countries will continue to kind of nip at each other's heels for a while, but not much will happen.
Dr. Jian Ghazvinian, I thank you so much for this today.
That's my pleasure. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Dr. Jian Ghazvinian, an author, historian, and former journalist. He is currently the executive director of the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. His latest book, published this past year, is entitled America and Iran, A History from 1720 to the Present. Dr. Jian Ghazvinian joined us from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania today. This is Full Time for the Roqe Media series, The Contemporary History of Iran, Part 14, brought to you with the support of Yazdani Law Group, one of Canada's largest immigration law firms, YLGPC, on Instagram. Please check out our regular editions of Roqe and all things related at roqemedia.com. That's our website, where you can also find out information about becoming a sponsor or a patron to help us out. Roqemedia.com. Thanks to the whole team who make this happen. Talented Anahita, Super Parisa, Ponta the artist, Savi Roham, Roqe Mehdad, the fabulous Kian, Captain Reza, and Groovy Shaya. Thank you to all of you out there supporting us and sharing our content. Please subscribe if you've not done so already. Find me on Instagram at Jian Ghomeshi. Mizun Bashin.